Toddler-Hunting by Kono Taeko. Originally Yoji-gari, 1961. Hayashi Akiko couldn't abide little girls between 3 and 10 years old. She detested them more than any other kind of human being. If Akiko, like most women, had married and had babies, she might by now have a child just that age. And what, she often wondered, if she'd had a girl? What then? She knew that men often said they hated children, only to turn into doting fathers once they had their own. But Akiko couldn't picture her own abhorrence ever yielding to maternal love, an emotion she scarcely possessed anyway. Foreign little girls, even at that age, were slightly more bearable, perhaps because their race was more glaring than their gender. If she'd married a foreigner, she might have been able to stand having a daughter of mixed blood, but if not, she was sure that she would have been a horribly cruel mother. She wouldn't have been satisfied just being cold and harsh to her daughter. Her loathing would have required more extreme measures. Akiko's dislike of little girls was of an entirely different order than her disdain for happy, attractive, conceited women her own age, or for young men throwing their weight around, or for smug, complacent old people. It was more like a phobia, the repulsion some people feel when confronted with small creatures like snakes or cats or frogs. Akiko could not bear to remember that she herself had once been a little girl. But in fact, her childhood had been happier than other periods of her life. She couldn't recall a single hardship. She might have been the most fortunate child who ever lived, a cheerful thing when she was young. But beneath the sunny disposition, in the pit of her stomach, she'd been conscious of an inexplicable constriction. Something loathsome and repellent oppressed all her senses. It was as if she were trapped in a long, narrow tunnel, as if a sticky liquid seeped unseen out of her every pore, as if she were under a curse. Once, in science class, they'd had a lesson about silkworms, and with a scalpel the teacher had sliced open a cocoon. Akiko took one look at the faintly squirming pupa, a filthy dark thing, slowly binding itself up in thread, issuing from its own body, and knew she was seeing the embodiment of the feelings that afflicted her. And then, for some reason, Akiko became convinced that other girls her age shared her strange inner discomfort. Grown-ups, however, did not feel this way, and neither did little boys and older girls. And sure enough, once she was past 10, this queasiness left her. It felt like she had stepped out of a tunnel into the vast free universe, where finally she could breathe. It was at this time, however, that she started to feel nauseated by any girl still passing through that stage, and her repulsion grew stronger as the years went by. The more typical a girl this age, the less Akiko could bear to be near her. The pallid complexion, the rubbery flesh, the bluish shadow at the nape of the neck left by the bobbed haircut, the unnaturally high, insipid way the girl would talk, even the cut and color of her clothes. Akiko saw in all this the filthy closeness she had glimpsed in the pupa. She could hardly bear to look at a little girl, still less touch one. Her horror remained undiminished to the present day. But little boys now. Akiko found little boys extremely appealing at that age. She didn't know exactly when her attraction for them first surfaced, but with every passing year, she found their company more intoxicating. Lately, her encounters with little boys had been intensely pleasurable. Sasaki had taken the express to Osaka on business. When Akiko saw him off at the train station, he'd handed her a package, a new shirt. He'd found out it was poorly finished when he got it home, he said. His local tailor had tried to fix it, but Sasaki wanted Akiko to exchange it for him. So she headed for the department store where he had bought it, in Nihonbashi. She ran her errand. It was nearly 5 o'clock when she left the store for the subway station, hurrying to get ahead of the evening rush. But her pace slowed as she passed a well-known store specializing in children's wear. It was late in summer, still very hot. Heavy afternoon sunlight flooded the pavement, but in the shady showcase window, autumn had already arrived. Pretty little shirts for boys were out on display, pinned up. The clothes leaned in various directions, sticking out their sturdy elbows and gesturing with their arms. One shirt almost seemed to be doing a headstand. Its front, with its little button neck opening, was folded so its square little chest puffed out. This was probably the only short-sleeved one, to judge by its lack of bulk, but the material looked heavy enough for autumn. It was probably a light woolen weave. Akiko was enchanted by the intensity of its broad red and blue horizontal stripes, and by the soft-looking, neatly folded collar in the same design. Nothing in the window was tagged, so Akiko tried guessing its price. The shirt probably cost at least 1,500 yen. Things she liked tended to be expensive. Her rapture made her an easy target. A clerk in a white short-sleeved shirt approached. "For your son, madame? How old is he?" Ignoring the question, Akiko asked the price of the shirt. 1,700 yen. "Just what I guessed," Akiko said, feeling, if anything, rather pleased. "Shall I get it out?" The clerk reached toward the glass panels at the back of the showcase. "Oh, please don't," Akiko begged, hastily. "It's all right." At that moment, they were interrupted. To Akiko's relief, the clerk was called to the telephone at back of the store. She knew that once she touched that adorably sweet shirt, she'd never be able to get out of the shop without it. But before going off to take the call, the clerk quickly took out the shirt and pressed it into her hands. "It doesn't hurt to look." Akiko stroked the garment tenderly. She could just see a little boy, about 4 years old, pulling on this cozy, lightweight shirt, his sunburned head popping up through the neck. When the time came, he would insist he wanted to do it by himself. Crossing his chubby arms over his chest, concentrating with all his might, he would just manage to grasp the shirt tails. But pulling it up over his head was going to be difficult. Closing his eyes, wiggling his rear end, he would twist around, struggling his hardest, revealing his tight, round belly full to bursting with the food he ate every mealtime. The shirt, though, was not going to come off, however hard he tried. Drawn by the charm of the little boy's clothes, and especially by the scenes to which they gave rise in her mind, Akiko had several times ended up buying something. A pair of reversible shorts with brick-colored cuffs, a deerstalker cap of white terry cloth with a tiny pale maroon check, a miniature pea jacket about 1.5 feet high. When she'd purchased something, she would seek out a woman friend with a toddler to dress. Once she'd settled on her prey, she would set out to bestow her gift. It didn't matter that she normally never gave the woman a second thought. Sometimes they'd even had a falling out. She would bewilder the recipient or make her cringe in embarrassment. Indifferent about her own clothing, Akiko was obsessed with garments for little boys, so naturally her taste in these had become extremely refined. The people selected to receive her gifts would be dumbfounded. How could this woman, who wasn't a mother herself, find such wonderfully appropriate clothes? Some thought they could guess the motive behind these fits of generosity: unfulfilled maternal love. Akiko bought the shirt and left the shop with a box under her arm. In no time at all, she had marked out the recipient of her next gift. She'd heard that the opera troupe of which she'd once been a member was now performing Madame Butterfly, and that the son of one of her old colleagues was playing the part of Madame Butterfly's child. She trained her sights on this little boy. When Akiko had quit the company, she'd had good reasons. Her prospects weren't improving. She was over 30, she couldn't be a member of the chorus forever, and besides, a bout of tuberculosis had damaged her health. Rather than having quit, it might be more accurate to say that circumstances had forced her to fade away. And yet, back when she had graduated from the College of Music, Her achievements had been impressive. She had given solo recitals, winning praise from a famous music critic. "Such a feel for the music," he had written in a review, "especially in the last piece, Mozart's Longing for Springtime." The fact was that she'd been on the diva track, but as things turned out, she had landed in the chorus, a source of anguish for Akiko. Even now, she found it difficult to ignore the opera world, though all news of it brought her terrible fits of distress. She'd made no effort to stay in touch with her one-time colleagues. But that evening, just as Madame Butterfly and Suzuki were singing their lines, "Is poverty upon us? This money is all we have?" Akiko appeared backstage, astonishing the company. "I heard Noguchi Masayo's son is performing," she remarked, but her business wasn't with these people. She'd timed her arrival to coincide with the end of the opera, when the child was on stage, and she didn't have to wait long before he appeared. "I saw an article about it in the newspaper," Akiko said, when Masayo stepped into the dressing room, her little boy in tow. "How exciting! Your son on stage!" She leaned down to look at the boy, who was hiding behind his mother. Masayo had made her debut several years after Akiko, playing roles like Anina, the maid in La Traviata, and the gardener's daughter in Le Nozze de Figaro. She was a cut above the chorus. When she sang, her photograph appeared in the program. Today, however, she was there to look after her little boy. "Is this the star himself, and only 4 years old? Is everything going well?" "Oh yes, he's a gutsy little guy, really," Masayo replied. "And anyway, he doesn't have to do much. He seems to be managing pretty well." "Oh, I'm not surprised. You can see it in his face," Akiko said, her gaze lingering on the boy's soft, plump earlobes, and his cheeks, tawny and smooth like little biscuits. "Do you sing too?" the child inquired. "Me?" Akiko was slightly taken aback. "No, Auntie doesn't." "Yes, what are you doing now?" Masayo asked, as if sensing Akiko's discomfort. What was she doing? Well, generally people who are asked such a thing aren't expected to give any impressive reply. Akiko was no exception to the rule. She decided to take the question as referring to how she was making ends meet. "Oh, I manage with my Italian skills," she replied vaguely. "Of course, I remember. There aren't many people who speak it as well as you." Akiko's Italian was, in fact, splendid. She had shown a remarkable aptitude for the language, now much more than a vehicle for singing opera. In the chorus, she'd never had a hope of making a living, and she'd been thrown back on her language skills to survive. She had earned extra money by translating articles for fashion magazines and tutoring younger company members. Nowadays, she worked part-time at a compressor factory. She was called in whenever the company had to correspond with Italian clients. The technical language had posed difficulties at first, since no Italian-Japanese dictionary was complete enough. She'd taken the words she couldn't decipher, with her English and German counterparts, to the engineering section to ask for help. This was where she'd gotten to know Sasaki, who usually dealt with her queries. "You've got a good deal," he remarked when they first chatted at length, not having to work 9 to 5. But the part-time pay was a pittance. It was impossible to meet expenses with her Italian alone, even with her other odd jobs here and there. She'd found extra income as a dictation assistant to one of the translators working on a complete set of opera libretti. This job allowed her to indulge herself by buying little garments for little boys. But preferring to steer Masayo away from these topics, she cheerfully pressed the parcel into her hands and said, "This is a present to celebrate his debut." "Oh my goodness, you didn't need to." "That's all right, I wanted to," Akiko said, directing her last words to the boy. What is it?" he asked. "I wonder now whether I shouldn't have brought a toy," Akiko said. "Won't you try it on?" Masayo was still hesitant to accept, but Akiko, tearing off the wrapping paper, pulled out her gift. "Oh, it's lovely." Masayo was getting more and more uncomfortable. Akiko, however, had already removed the boy's costume and was getting him into the shirt she had chosen. "What do you think? Isn't it cute?" she asked. "Oh yes, and it's a perfect fit." "What a lucky boy," a girl who was packing up her costume nearby chimed in. "Does the little lad have a name?" Akiko asked. "I remember seeing it in the papers, but I—" "Darling, this lady wants to know your name. You can tell her yourself, can't you? And don't forget to say thank you." "My name is Noguchi Shuichi. Thank you." Akiko laughed. "Can you take it off by yourself, Shuichi?" The child nodded. "Go on then, show me." The boy in his comfy red and blue shirt shrugged petulantly. "I don't want to." "You like it, don't you?" Masayo said. "Even children know when something's extra special. Will you wear that home, Shuichi?" The child looked up at his mother and nodded. Akiko was thrilled. The shirt was a good fit and also a great success with the boy, but she couldn't resist one last shot at getting to watch him try to get himself out of it. "It's a little warm for this shirt, you know," she said. "You don't want to sweat, Shu. Let's take it off and have Mommy carry it home. We can wear it as much as we like when the weather gets cooler. What a big boy," she added before he could object. "Shu can get undressed all by himself." Akiko unbuttoned the neck of the shirt and placed her hands on the chubby little arms sticking out of the short sleeves. She crossed his arms, one over the other, savoring their softness and perspiration, and made sure that each hand grasped the hem. "Now lift your arms up over your head. Got it?" Just as she'd imagined, the child started to twist and turn about, wiggling his bottom. Akiko backed off to get a better look, but to her chagrin, Masayo decided to lend him a hand. Catching the shirt from behind, she pulled it up and slipped it off over his head in no time. "Easy, isn't it?" Akiko said, crossing her own arms. "Like this, then up and over." The child nodded. He copied her, crossing his arms, bringing them up, and letting them fall loosely over his bare belly. "Perfect!" In an excess of joy, Akiko laughed out loud, showing off her soprano voice for the first time in years. "You little darling." "I thought you didn't like children, Miss Hayashi," remarked a member of the chorus standing nearby. Akiko knew perfectly well what she meant, and Masayo was probably thinking the same thing. Some years ago, when Akiko was still with the company, a woman, now on tour in Europe, had played Madame Butterfly with her own child on stage. Akiko was so blatantly repulsed by that child that it had become something of a scandal. The mother, who had joined the troupe at the same time as Akiko, was the star of the company, and her colleagues had concluded that her loathing sprang from jealousy. "She doesn't have to take it out on a 4-year-old, she'd heard them mutter. Only Akiko knew the real reason. That the child was a girl. But tonight Akiko passed it off as a change of heart. "The older you get," she replied, "the more you appreciate children." On the way home from her transcription job, Akiko bought some things in the shops in front of the station and reached her apartment as dusk fell. Her last purchase, the block of ice, had almost completely soaked its newspaper wrappings, and her fingers were frozen numb. Struggling to hold her shopping, the evening paper, and a postcard from her mailbox, she could barely turn her key in the lock. As she stepped inside her apartment, she felt something underfoot. A telegram had been pushed under her door, from Sasaki. He'd been due to visit her place that night, following his morning return. The telegram had been dispatched from the Osaka Central Post Office. He'd had to go on to Hiroshima, Sasaki said, so he'd be delayed 2 or 3 days. "In touch soon," the closing words ran. The delivery time was stamped at 8:30 that morning. She must have just missed it on her way out. Strange that had been the requested delivery time. Sasaki had most likely been instructed to go on to Hiroshima by the Tokyo office or by a superior who'd joined him on the trip. But however the change of plan had been announced, he was bound to have become aware of it sometime yesterday between 9 and 5. Why had he delayed letting her know until 8:30 this morning? Taking a second look, she saw that he had actually dispatched the telegram last night at 11:37, after which he would have taken the night train to Hiroshima, with an easy morning arrival. It had no doubt simply slipped his mind to send the telegram earlier. He must have been out on the town, and then wanted to avoid giving her a shock in the middle of the night. Akiko tossed the slip of paper aside. To think she had gone to the trouble of buying ice. In touch soon. What did he mean? Forgive me, he should have said. Miss Hayashi, it was her superintendent's voice. Do you have a delivery from the liquor store? Akiko went downstairs where the delivery man was depositing 3 bottles of beer just inside the entrance. Hovering nearby was the superintendent, an old woman whose rimless eyeglasses gave her an officious air. You got a telegram, didn't you? Yes. Everything all right? Fine, Akiko replied shortly, gathering up the bottles. Back in her room, Akiko set about stabbing the ice block with a pick used to open milk bottles. Putting some of the ice shards in a glass, she topped them up with beer. She didn't usually drink, and she didn't particularly like the taste, but it was pleasantly chilly, and she downed 2 glasses one after the other. Remembering the potato chips she'd flung down on her way in, she reached for the bag and tore it open, but after 1 bite, she stopped. Her heart was racing. A rush of heat came over her. She had to lie down. She remembered the ice. She could wrap some in a towel for her forehead. That would make her feel better, but it was too much trouble to get up. She lay where she was, sprawled out on the floor. When she opened her eyes, the room was dark. The luminous hands of the clock stood at a little past 8 o'clock, and crickets were chirping outside. It was September, and while the days were still hot, there was a nip in the evening air. She had perspired, and her clothes felt cold and clammy against her skin, now that it was no longer flushed with drink. An unmarried woman past 30 losing her temper because a man 2 years her junior didn't keep his date. Who got drunk on the beer she'd bought for him and that was far too strong for her, and who came to her senses in a pitch-dark room? Who ever heard of such a thing? After sneezing several times, Akiko forced a bitter smile. She stood up, turned on the light, pulled a blanket out of the cupboard, and lay down again. A woman is supposed to weep at a time like this, she thought, not smile. It won't be a long drawn-out thing when we break up, Sasaki had once told her. One day we'll have a fight, and that'll be that. Well, you chose the right person, didn't you? She'd retorted, and was immediately angry at herself. Why did she have to be so disagreeable? This sourness of hers was precisely what made him say such things. Had Sasaki been pointing out her danger in being such a willful woman? No, that interpretation was too romantic. He'd only meant that he was aware of how little she was committed to him, or, for that matter, to any aspect of her life. We both chose the right person, Sasaki had replied, so we should try our best to get along. Though they were single and still relatively young, the subject of a future together rarely came up for discussion. They didn't even try living together. About the sort of marriage he'd want, Sasaki had any number of typical requirements. He would no doubt settle down late in life with a nice little wife able to meet them. Akiko didn't have these qualities, nor did she care to develop them, but she couldn't, on the other hand, tolerate fussy older men, and was bored by ones of high standing in business or society who would in all likelihood be married anyway. They understood these things about themselves and about each other, and were aware of their mutual knowledge. For him, she was a stopgap companion. For her, he filled a superficial role as her partner, and the one thing that kept them together was their compatible sexual tastes. Akiko remembered the first time she was distinctly attracted to Sasaki was when he'd told her about a night he spent helping a woman in labor. It had happened when he was still a student, right after the war. I was getting ready for bed, Sasaki had told her, when my old landlady rushed into my room, all in a panic. The baby's coming, the baby's coming. Well, don't you think you'd better lie down? I asked. Her belly was out to here, you know. Don't be an idiot, she said to me, very offended. You know I'm a widow. It was the woman on the second floor who was having the baby. Her husband was a drunk of a journalist. He never came home, and he wasn't around that night either, and the baby was already halfway born, so she couldn't be taken to the hospital. The whole second floor was in an uproar. The old lady told me to heat some water on the first floor and take it up to them. I'd put the water on to boil, Sasaki continued, when the old woman came to my room again. Now she made me go find a midwife. The first person they'd sent out hadn't returned. Well, finding a midwife in the middle of the night isn't easy, you know. I finally spotted an advertisement for one posted to a telegraph pole and raced over to the address, only to be told the woman had moved away 5 years back. By this time I was getting pretty fed up, I can tell you, but I had to do something for the poor woman, and I finally found another old woman. But by the time I brought her back, it was all over. Still, it's good to get the umbilical cord cut by someone who knows what they're doing. I headed back to my room, and there at my door was the old woman again. Now they needed someone to get rid of the afterbirth water, she said. Well, I did what she told me and the guy who lived in the next room. She told us to throw it away on some farm patch, as far away as possible. But you weren't going to catch me carrying a tub of water like that any farther than I had to, sloshing all over the place, scum splashing me right in the mouth. Anywhere will do, we thought, and sluiced it down a drain right there on the corner. Was it a boy or a girl? Akiko had asked. The baby? A healthy little boy. Sasaki's story had had the most unexpected effect on Akiko. Why had she felt so attracted to him? Because of some story about an escapade helping a woman in labor, someone he didn't even know? She couldn't figure it out. Was it his freshness, his boyishness? No, it couldn't have been just that. What had drawn her had been the ruthless streak she detected beneath that innocent story of helping a woman in trouble. That had gotten to her, and her hunch had proved correct. Later, she'd found out that Sasaki possessed just the predilections she liked. From the way he said, a healthy little boy, though, Sasaki appeared to also have a paternal streak. How did this fit in? Akiko remembered the postcard in her mail from Noguchi Masayo. Reaching for it, she started reading. Masayo began with the customary seasonal greetings and some words about the joy at seeing her after so many years. Last night was closing night, she continued. Shuichi normally wakes up early in the morning, but today he dozed past 9. He must be relieved now that the opera is over. It's funny to think of children feeling that way. He loves the shirt you gave him. He's always telling me he wants to wear it. We can't wait for this hot weather to cool down. Akiko wasn't as annoyed as she'd expected. Shuichi normally wakes up early in the morning. She'd enjoyed turning the words over in her mind, but just as she never bought little garments with a particular child in mind, to arrange another encounter with Shuichi to see him wearing her gift was out of the question. She wondered how Sasaki would react if she told him she wanted a baby. Most likely he'd pick a fight, storm off, and never return. Akiko's period was always regular, except for once, when she'd made Sasaki whip her so violently that she couldn't stand up for 2 days, and it came 2 weeks late. But there was hardly a month when it didn't arrive on time, the bright red blood floating in the white porcelain bowl before being whirled away with the water. When she'd been younger, Akiko had been amazed by her body, by its strangeness. Every month, over and over, it made a little bed inside for a baby, unaware that none would be born, and then took it apart again. And it had seemed to her a grave matter that not one person on this earth was created yet out of her own blood. But she would always find herself wondering how, after giving birth to the baby, she could get someone else to take care of it, and whether there wasn't some way she could reserve the right to only occasionally oversee its care. She began to greatly envy men who could avoid parental tasks so easily. All this surely proved how poorly she was endowed with natural maternal urges. And then, 2 or 3 years ago, there had been her bout of pulmonary TB. Her case had been serious, and though her recovery had been surprisingly rapid, She had been told by her doctors that she should never try to have a child. She would never survive. And by now, even had they told her she could have a baby, Akiko no longer wished for one. Aside from the question of how she would arrange it, her physical and emotional stamina had been quite worn down by the disease, and she was so impatient, the thought of being tied down by such a long commitment was insufferable. This, she thought, was probably what kept her in the relationship with Sasaki. For all these reasons, she had become a woman for whom maternal love was a totally alien emotion, a woman even less able to think of bringing up children. Akiko now felt at ease knowing that having a baby was out of the question for her body. When this fact came to mind, she felt an emotion close to joy. It was already 9 o'clock. She needed to eat, but she stayed sprawled out on the floor. She had recovered her equanimity. The frustration she'd felt began to change into a different sort of excitement. Often, after surges of emotion, a strange fantasy world would descend and take her in its sway. She chose to stay on the floor in the hope of this happening, and already there were signs of it starting. As the dream world spread out about her, Akiko would plunge herself into it, her pulse beating faster and faster, and her skin all moist. She would reach ecstasy, losing all self-control. Two figures always appeared in this strange world, a little boy of 7 or 8 and a man in his 30s. The details of their personalities and activities varied slightly each time, but the age gap remained constant, as did their relationship as father and child. Their faces were out of focus, but it was important for Akiko to be able to believe that the child, at least, was very, very sweet. The man would be thrashing the child and scolding him in so gentle a tone that it was harrowing. The beating would start out as the kind any father might give his son, but gradually it would reach a level of horrifying atrocity. At the very climax of the scene, however, the thought of the impossibility of such things actually happening in the real world would surface in her mind, and Akiko would return abruptly to herself. Her face would be flushed, but she'd know that she was back in reality. "You really disappoint me," the father starts. "I'm going to have to teach you a lesson. A crash as the father whacks the child across the face, almost knocking his head off. The child staggers under the blow, and then gets back on his feet straight away, trying to bear the pain, but he is unable to resist, touching his cheek furtively. "Hasn't Daddy warned you time and again not to do that? I suppose it takes more than one lesson to make you understand." The father issues an order to someone, and an alligator skin belt is placed in front of him. "Take off your clothes." The child does as he is told, and the father begins whipping his buttocks with the belt. "How about using our other implement?" The voice is a woman's. The belt is dropped, and he picks up a cane. More punishment. With every lash of the cane, there are shrieks and agonized cries. The child is sent sprawling forward, sometimes flat on his face, but he struggles to get up each time, ready to receive the next stroke, a course of action he carries out without being told. The bleeding seems to have begun. The woman's voice again. There it is, the blood, streaming down in a line over the child's buttocks, over his thighs. The blood is smeared over the surface of his flesh by yet more thrashes of the cane. Another lash from the father. More blood spurts out. Now 2 lines of blood, as if racing each other, trickle steadily down. But suddenly the flow comes to a halt. Looking closely, one sees the blood has dried. The scene is, after all, taking place in the full heat of a blazing summer sun. "Hit me on my back, father," the child begs. "I was leaving that till last. There's no hurry." The father sets down the cane and, taking the child over to a corrugated metal shack, grabs him by the shoulders and forces him against the scorching metal. The child tries to escape, wriggling around and desperately pushing himself away, but to no avail. He is pinned by the heavy body of the father, pressed flat against the searing hot side. There follows the hiss of roasting flesh. The father pulls the child from the shack. The child totters, about to faint, but the father hauls him up. Then he turns the child around so that the woman can get a good look at the burnt, flayed back. The dark red-colored stripes left by the ridges of hot metal. There is more to come, but now the child crumples to the ground when told to stand. More scolding. The father ties the child's hands together and suspends him from the branch of the tree. "What else should I see to?" the father asks. "You haven't touched his stomach," the woman's voice again, insinuating. The child gets a few lashes on his belly, and suddenly his stomach splits open. Intestines, an exquisitely colored rope of violet, slither out. The woman gives the order. The father cuts the cord around the child's hands. The child drops down from the branch to the ground. Now the father pulls the purple rope until it is tight and jerks the child's body about as if trying to get a kite to rise into the air. The little body at the end of the purple rope is slammed against the corrugated metal shack repeatedly. Every twitch on the rope brings forth pitiful, horrifying screams. Akiko saw Sasaki when she went into work at the factory. As they walked down the corridor, he asked, "Feeling better? Doesn't it look like it? You gave me a scare." "Serves you right, sending telegrams in the middle of the night." Akiko had spent the previous night with Sasaki, but she hadn't mentioned the telegram. "But it was delivered the next morning, wasn't it?" he asked. "Yes, that's what bothers me. What were you doing that you got to the post office so late?" "Oh, I went to the night baseball game, and—" They were in front of the accounting department. Akiko had come in to collect her wages. She disappeared behind the door, leaving him in mid-sentence. Back at home, Akiko started to clear up. That morning, in her hurry to get to work, she had left her room just as it was. A few pearls had rolled here and there on the floor. The night before, Akiko had wanted to add a little variety to their usual routine, and she'd looked around frantically for something to help. Finally, she hit upon a pearl necklace. "They're not real," she said, handing them to him. Hey, not bad." Sasaki dangled the necklace from his fingertips to tantalize her. Then, gripping it tightly, he circled around her. Akiko was already so aroused she felt as if every nerve in her body was concentrated in the flesh of her back. When he brought the beads down on her skin, however, the sting and the smart cracking were over as soon as they started. The thread of the necklace snapped, and with a dull patter, pearls scattered across the floor. Sasaki and Akiko laughed, a little uncertainly. 2 strands of thread, a few pearls still clinging to them, hung from Sasaki's fist. Putting them in the lid of a mosquito coil box, he began crawling around on his hands and knees, hunting up the others. Akiko watched him with growing vexation. "Just leave them, can't you?" Hearing her own tone of voice, she was disappointed to realize that the mood had left her. But the next moment, Sasaki caught sight of a vinyl wash rope hanging in a corner, the type with plastic knobs and metal hooks at either end. As he reached for it and started doubling it up, Akiko was already begging him to use the jagged metal hooks on her. They'd make a clicking sound. It depended on what they used, but they both enjoyed the sound things made whipped against her skin. The more excited the noises made them, the more they would have to suppress their cries. That night, however, Sasaki had been especially resourceful with that length of rope, and Akiko's screams smothered out the thrashing sound. At first they hadn't realized somebody was knocking on the door. "What's that?" Sasaki froze in mid-stroke, and by an unfortunate coincidence, a fire engine siren started wailing through the neighborhood. Akiko's heart gave a leap. Pulling a shirt over his shoulders, Sasaki put his face round the door. "I was a little worried." It was the voice of the old superintendent with rimless eyeglasses. "I don't want them to have to carry you out of there dead." The other tenants of the building were familiar with the goings-on in this room. That night, however, they must have gone a little too far. Sorry, we didn't mean to worry you. In any case, keep it down, won't you? Remember, there are other people living in this building. Sorry, really. Listening to their voices, Akiko suddenly felt sick. For a moment, she thought she would vomit. She lay down, but already everything before her eyes was black. What's wrong? The window, Akiko said, pushing back the curtain, billowing out over her face like a sail in the breeze. I'm very cold. The shock thinking that a fire had started, had that sent the blood in her already racing heart into turmoil? A moment before, her body had been a mass of red-hot iron filings leaping around in space. Now she was aware of it cooling down rapidly. She didn't seem to have lost consciousness, though. She could hear Sasaki's voice at some distance and herself responding. Or at least, so she had thought. Afterwards, he told her that there had been 30 minutes or so when she'd had no reaction to anything he said, and her pulse had grown steadily weaker. Akiko brought a hand to her brow, and her fingers were stiff with cold. Sasaki released her other wrist and stood up. This is bad. There was the sound of his belt being buckled. Where are you going? To get a doctor. I'm all right, Akiko said, her eyes closed, and she was beginning to feel a little better. A damp hand towel had been pushed down between her breasts, she realized, and she was covered by a blanket and quilt. I really thought they would have to carry a corpse out of here, Sasaki said the next morning, recounting the scene to her. I want you to prepare a testimonial. What for? Just so there's something about our sexual habits, maybe having certain consequences, and if I do end up killing you, to prove it was an accident. All right, don't worry, I'll do it. It was 3 p.m. when Akiko set out for the neighborhood public bath. Only 7 or 8 women were there. A new mother with her baby, some old women with nothing better to do, and young women bathing before going off to work in the evening. For some reason, perhaps having to do with the design of the bathhouse, clients tended to cluster around the middle of the changing room, while in the bathroom itself they took up places along the outer wall. Hardly anyone could be seen elsewhere. Akiko had purposely chosen a time when the place would be empty, and making sure to conceal her cuts with her wash towel, she picked her way over the tiles, which were covered with dry grains of scrubbing detergent, to an area where there was nobody at all. At the far end of the room, the water in the bath was always very hot, so hot that, especially when the temperature had just been stoked, nobody dared enter it for a while. There, in the corner, in front of the faucets, Akiko would take up her position. When she was ready to soak her body in the hot water, she would immerse herself first in a tub that was adjacent, where a trickle of cold water flowed in. As she soaked, Akiko would keep an eye on the changing room, which she could keep in sight because the separating doors had been drawn back. Were there any cute little boys with their mothers? Wasn't even one going to come over and join her? If she did see a little boy, darkly tanned from the knees down, playing by the edge of the bath with a little boat or a soapbox lid, Akiko couldn't resist giving him one of her special winks. The child never failed to respond. He would float his boat her way on a reconnaissance trip, and she would then make waves, sending it back on a storm, happy to go on playing in the bath forever, rescuing the boat if it sank, and starting up a conversation. Somewhere the mother would be calling her son, but he wouldn't go. Finally, the mother would come and pull him away, one arm gripped by his mother, the other clasping the boat to his chest. The little boy would turn to look back for an instant at Akiko. Then he would head off, his plump little feet smacking the wet tiles. Akiko would get out of the water, a melancholy smile on her lips. Today, as a result of last night's wild abandon, closer, in fact, to an act of self-annihilation, Akiko longed more than ever for a little boy to appear. It was a strange attachment that she had to little boys, one which she preferred to keep Sasaki in the dark about. The bathing area was filling up, but it didn't look as if Akiko's wish would be granted today. Wanting to escape before it got too crowded, she left after a quick scrub without getting into the hot tub at all. Akiko walked home, keeping to the shady side of the street. Then, just as she entered an alley, turning the corner by the vegetable shop, she encountered a little boy. He was about 3 years old, a toddler she hadn't seen before. Dressed in a grubby athletic jersey and putty-colored pants, he was standing by a stack of cartons and baskets, struggling with a chunk of watermelon. Akiko got a little closer. "Good?" she asked as an opening gambit. The child nodded, without raising his eyes. Wanting a little more of a reaction, she tried again. "Is that good?" "It's good." He gave a clear answer this time. Pointing the little forefinger of his right hand like a pistol, he was using it to dig out the seeds. But his finger was poking around a little too eagerly, so all the seeds seemed to dive back deeper inside their holes. It was only a small chunk of watermelon, cut from a larger slice, but the chunk appeared quite unwieldy. His arms were so stubby and his fists so small. The child was totally absorbed, concentrating on digging out one particular seed. Refusing to go on to others nearer the surface, he held the chunk in one hand, turning it this way and that, vainly trying with his other to hook out that one recalcitrant seed. Akiko watched as he plunged his finger into the watermelon flesh. The juice spurted out, running down his fingers and all over his wrist, changing to the color of vinegar as it mixed with the sweat and grime collected from the various escapades of his day. His concentration momentarily broken, the boy looked up and took in Akiko's presence. "Difficult, isn't it?" she said. The child grunted. Akiko knelt and put her bath bag on her knee. "Let Auntie see." She pulled his fingers out of the watermelon. She had wanted to keep the boy's hands in her own, holding the chunk with him, but he gave the fruit up to her and wiped his dripping fingers on the seat of his pants. The seed was lodged at the very end of a deep hole. "Do you want Auntie to get it out?" The child grunted again, rubbing his fist like a harmonica against his lips. Akiko poked with her little finger, and the seed slipped out. "Good at it, aren't I?" "You're a grown-up." "Well then, leave it to me," Akiko laughed, keeping the fruit. She proceeded to pick out every seed in the chunk, now mauled to an oozing red mass, including the ones that poked their heads out of the loose, wet pulp. "Now," she said, holding it out to him, "take a bite." Using both hands, the child brought the watermelon to his mouth, and with each bite, juice gushed over his small, soft-looking upper lip. While he worked on swallowing a mouthful, he would pull the chunk of fruit down with a sharp jerk and hold it in front of him. 2 bright red streaks were pointing up like flames from either side of his mouth. "Hey," Akiko said, unable to resist, "won't you give me some of that?" In silence, the child offered up the watermelon. Akiko took hold of it with her hands over his, pulling the boy up to her. She sank her teeth into the fruit, and the mouthful of watermelon was so pulpy and warm, it was like biting into live flesh. "Good?" the child asked. Akiko nodded gravely, squeezing as much flavor as she could out of the mouthful of fruit, savoring the tang of the child's sweat, the grime from his fingers, even his saliva, before letting it slide slowly down her throat. Little boys inhabited such an infinitely wholesome world. Akiko always had the impression that it restored and purified her. Its simplicity was so all-encompassing that anything out of the ordinary about her could pass without notice there. Little boys went along with her in her games. Sometimes they almost seemed to egg her on. Akiko realized that she was still holding the watermelon and the boy's hands up close to her. "Thank you," she said, letting them go. "That was delicious." The child stared intently at the watermelon, and before she knew it, he had given it back. "You have it," he said. "I don't want it anymore." He probably no longer wanted to eat it now that somebody else's mouth had touched it. He ran off, wiping his fingers on the seat of his trousers. A little way down the street he stopped, turned, and looked back at Akiko, who stood rooted to the spot, not knowing what to do with the unexpected gift in her hands.